as Susan mentioned, we're going to do a little bit of a flip. So I'm going to go through the steps of what we're working on in this class in GoCrop. And then when Heather joins us, she'll go over a little bit more in detail some of the background components of understanding what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing in this portion of the nutrient management plan. By this point, hopefully most folks have their farm open or started and maybe began working on their narrative last week. If you haven't finished your narrative for homework this week, that's okay. But what we're going to work on this week is entering information into your fields. So after you log in, you can click work with your farm. And then you can see on our left-hand side, we have these menu options, and we're going to choose fields. And if you're starting brand new, you can see you have no fields entered. And as you know, nutrient management planning is a field by field situation. So we're going to walk through how to create new fields. So to do that, we're going to click this orange button in the upper right-hand corner. And you can see that it opens up this long form. So I'm going to show you how to open up and go through the long form, and then how to enter fields just using this top section if that's what you want to do. So there's a couple different options to get your fields laid out, and then we'll enter soil tests after that. So let's start with your field name. Make sure to use a field name that makes sense to you and potentially isn't like 100 characters long. So if that's like the field out back or next to the barn or Shirley's field, that's great. Some folks also use their track and field number here. You can do that here, but also it's required to enter that below. So if and everywhere in GoCrop, your field name and your FSA track and field number show up together. So you don't need to worry about having just one of those names showing at the same time. So I'm going to call this field 1. You can look up your field size. That might be on your maps. It might be in a spreadsheet that your land treatment planner has created for you, and you might want to change those acreages if that makes sense. If you're like, yes, the field is outlined as 20 acres, but really I'm only using half of it, this is where you would put that in there. And this included since, again, this is an included since that just GoCrop uses for handling data. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. If you're like, did I get this field in 1990 or 1993? That doesn't matter so much. I would suggest though, that having an included since date from 2019 or back further. So if all your fields are 2019, that's okay, as long as you're not planning on entering any records for this field from 2018. You choose either if it's owned or leased. In this section, and then the county you can change, and that is helpful if you are going to choose a soil type. So it defaults to the county that your farm is located in. And as we can see here, we can scroll down here and we have our soil type, and these soil type names are the abbreviations associated with that county. So if you don't see your field or your soil type name here, you might need to change your county. So if we look at, for example, Orange County, it's going to take a moment to retrieve that. The soil series abbreviations would be different. I'm not going to wait for this. Let's see if I can change this back to Grand Isle, and it'll bring us back to something showing. And we're still revolving around. So there are two ways to enter soil information. One of them is completely manually, and one is a little bit of a hybrid between what GoCrop can pull from Surgo and your soil series fact sheet. So if you're entering them manually, you can choose your soil type here based on your the maps provided. And then most of the information fills out below. You'll need to refer to your soil series fact sheet for your water table depth and your bedrock. That's true if you choose it from the drop down. Alternatively, you can let GoCrop pick the soil series for your field by drawing it in. You do not need to draw your fields for GoCrop to work, but it's also really handy not only to generate your soil type associated with that field, but also if you end up using the app, it's really handy to see where your fields are and put your records in with the outline. There's also a field list in the map or in the app, but we can talk about the app afterwards if that's something you're interested in. So to draw your field in, you can enlarge the map by clicking this little square up in the right-hand corner. And then you just click to draw the corners. So we can do this here. This is going to be associated with field 1. We can make the map a little bit smaller by, again, clicking that little square in the upper right-hand corner. And then we can say, all right, well, now I want to fill in my soils based off of the area I've just mapped out. So you can click this button. And it's changed it for me. And again, I'll still need to refer to my soil series fact sheet to enter in the water table depth and depth of bedrock. I'm going to put in some random water table depths that aren't necessarily associated with this soil type, but when filling out the long form for your field information, you have to fill out every single piece in order for it to save. So that's why I'm putting something in here now. Depth of bedrock, again, just choosing this randomly, not necessarily associated with that soil type. All right, so now we're coming down to these Vermont nutrient management planning details, and a lot of this information is used to calculate your P index. So try to be as accurate as you can about this. So for your FSA tracking field number, normally that might be a 3-digit code followed by a 2 or 3-digit code, but you can refer to your maps for that. So track dash field number, some folks put a T here, some put an F for tracking field. And then if you're working on a field and you say, all right, I've got 20 acres here and it's track 630 and it's field 2, but really I manage them differently. Here's a great space to show that by saying, all right, well, it's field 2, but it's the northern portion of field 2. All right, so some of these conservation practices, vegetated buffer width. I'm not going to go into too much detail explaining how to calculate this, because I think Heather will go over this in her presentation today. But I will stress that no matter where your field is or how close it is to surface water, the minimum value that must be here is 25. It can be much greater than that, but the minimum is 25. The manure spreading setback, that is in addition to your vegetated buffer width, and typically for most people, this is 0. Has living vegetation in April. This is really getting at if it's like a perennial forage, it will be coming up in the spring, or if you planted a winter hardy cover crop, you can put yes here. This tile drainage is really specifically asking about pattern tile drainage. So a field that has tiles every 20, 15, or 30 feet, it's not asking about, oh, well, we have an orphan tile line to drain this one low spot. If you have a one tile in that field, it's no. But if you have something more systematic, then you would say yes here. Sediment trap structure is a legacy pulled over from a previous requirement. So I've only ever put none here. You might have something else in your field. And if you do, please enter the appropriate sediment trap structure. All right, risk factors. I know that topo maps are no longer supplied, but maybe your nutrient or your land treatment planner has provided a spreadsheet that will have elevation associated with each of your fields. If this is something you need help finding, we can work with you to do that. I don't have that information readily available for this field. So again, I'm just putting in some random numbers. Distance to stream. This is something, again, that Heather will go over during the class and how to calculate this. But again, the minimum distance to stream must be 25, just like your vegetated buffer. Frequently flooded, this is connected with like a map that will show if that field is frequently flooded or not. If in your experience, if you have a field that on the map shows it's frequently flooded, but in your experience it's not, you can apply through the state to have that exempt. There's some rules around frequently flooded fields with the dates of cover crop and some other management practices. I'm not going to dive too much into that right now. I think that's something that you can talk about with your land treatment planner, or Heather might go over in the lecture today. But typically it's no. And then your nitrogen leaching index, again, that was typically in the past provided in the map, and hopefully your land treatment planner has provided that in a spreadsheet. If not, there are other ways to find that. We can help you do that. All right, so this is a little bit of a typo here. It says Russell tolerable soil loss. Just pretend that you don't see that word Russell, because really this is the tolerable soil loss, and this number comes from your soil series fact sheet. It's a number that's inherent to the soil series and how quickly it can regenerate or keep sustained. It measures the amount of or potential amount of soil that can be lost in order for that soil type to still be productive. And typically these are whole numbers, and you know, I've seen them between like 1 and 5. Typically they're 3, but again, refer to your soil series fact sheet for that. And then in this section, you, at the end of this new field, you can write any water quality consideration. So that might be you've got a well nearby, or a neighbor, or you have some other pieces of infrastructure that you might want to mind, especially when you're applying any type of fertilizer or manure to that area. You can leave it blank if there aren't any water quality considerations, or you can write NA if you are feeling like you really want to put something in that box. So now I'm going to click Save Field, and if I've missed anything, the form will alert me and I can go back and add that without losing any of my information that I've entered. So success, we have entered the information required for one field, for just the field information. So I'm going to give you a sneak peek what's coming next, but then we're going to back up and just stick to fields. So before, right, we just had our field, we clicked on that, we created a new field, but now when we click on the field, we have all these sub tabs of information, right? So in the info is all the stuff that we just entered, and now we can see we can put soil tests in, and our Vermont nutrient management plant field details. There's also rotation, subtabs, crops, nutrient planning, and field records, but we're not there yet. We're just sticking in info today. So I think the other piece that, I'd like to show is how to enter information into your field. So at least you just get the list beginning. So remember, it's the same situation, right? You're going to click new field, and then you're going to enter your field name. Again, the size, your included since, if it's owned or leased, and the county. So if you just enter the details with under this blue heading, you don't go to maps or any other form, you can click Save Fields. And now that appears here. So when I open up the L-shaped field, we can see that none of these other sections are complete. And that's okay. You can go back and fill them in later. But if you open any of these tabs, then you have to fill out the entire form in order for it to save. And this is a part of the larger form, but just this part will need to be entered in order to save. Okay, my plan now is to just get one more field in here, and then I will show you how to import soil tests. I'm just taking a look at the chat here, and I see a question that asks, can we import the field map from a conservation plan? At this moment in GoCrop, there is not a way to import or export maps. All right, so there's a number of different places that you can import your soil tests. And one of them is right here in the field section, but just to go back to your farm, you can also import your field tests here in this import data section. So I think one of the things that's important to note is that you can only import soil tests for the fields you've created. So I'm going to click New Import. And for folks who are have sent their soil test to the UVM Agricultural Testing Lab, we have a template that will help us import from the soil lab. If you sent your samples to a different institution, there's still a way to import that data, but we just have to download the template and enter it in that way. If this is a situation that you have soil tests from another institution, then we can work with you to import that data. Okay, and so Cindy says in the chat, if you draw out maps, you can click on the map in the field to bring up the field. Yeah, so if you draw out the map, that'll help, that map will save in your field info, and that'll help bring up the soil tiers. And yes, thank you for clarifying, Cindy. Yes, if you have the GoCrop app, which is free with your license and subscription, there are 2 ways to look at your field information. One is in that field list that you see in GoCrop, but you can also see this nice outline of all your fields and a map on the app. Yes, it's great to add records. Thank you, Cindy. Okay, so from the UVM soil lab, I think the first key thing that we have to note here is that it says from a CSV file. And if you got a file from the ag testing lab, then you will know that it actually comes in an Excel spreadsheet. So can folks see my Excel spreadsheet? I've lost the ability to see. Thank you. I can't see anyone's faces right now. Perfect. So thank you for verbally saying that. Okay, so on our Excel spreadsheet, you can see that there's a bunch of information on it. There's a lab ID, there's the field names, there's an order number, the date, a bunch of information that we use in your nutrient management plan, and a bunch of minor nutrients that aren't typically used in nutrient management planning. So you don't need to do anything to the sheet, any of the data, but what you do need to do is convert the Excel spreadsheet into a CSV. So in order to do that, you click on File, Save As, and then here where you have the title, right below that is the format that it can be saved in. So you can click this down arrow and click as Save as CSV. I'm going to save that. Looks like it's saved. I'm going to close this. I'm going to come back to GoCrop accounts. And can someone just tell me again verbally, you can see the GoCrop account here?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So now we're going to import it. And we're going to say, all right, from the UVM soil lab, we're going to choose our file. And in my downloads, this is the only CSV file that's showing up, right? We can see what type it is here. And then we're going to click open. And it's saying, okay, we have 4 soil tests. And you can remember I only entered 3. And I did that on purpose to show you what happens when that happens. Okay, so now we can check and make sure that our fields that are listed in our soil test match the fields that we have entered into GoCrop. It needs to be a 1-for-1 match. And you can see that GoCrop does a pretty good job. It says, all right, well, you had one L shape in your CSV, and you had one in GoCrop. You had one by barn in your CSV, you had one in GoCrop. But we have this discrepancy here where we have a field 1 in our CSV, but so we need to match that with our field 1 in our GoCrop account. And so this is pretty simple. Now we've matched those. Now that data will import pretty easily. We can see like these discrepancies a lot when something might be misspelled, whether that's on the lab's end of making an O into an E or something like that. And then we can also see that there's this 4th soil test that I didn't create a field for, and I'm just not going to bother with that right now. If you scroll down, you can see that there's a bunch of information that I had showed you earlier that's on the CSV that we're not going to include. We don't need to have the order number in GoCrop or particularly the date. And then we have the results that GoCrop requires included. You can scroll down here, and then you can see that there's a bunch of results that GoCrop doesn't include. If you are feeling like these are nutrients you really, really, really want to track, you can say, all right, I'm going to include this, but I would not recommend that because it's just really going to clutter up not only your nutrient balance table when you're on screen on your computer, but also a lot of your reports. So if you're just starting out, I would stick with what GoCrop recommends. And by and large, when you're importing, I wouldn't necessarily scroll through and look at all this. This is pretty well set. I just kind of wanted to show you what that was. So then we click preview with these settings. And again, it says, okay, well, everything matched up for those 3 fields that you have in your GoCrop account and 3 fields you have in your CSV, but there's this 4th one we can't account for. And we don't have it entered into GoCrop. There's no way to put it in like that. So we're just gonna say, I'm gonna skip it. We'll deal with it later. And then we import. And we wait. And we don't have to wait that long. So it's just 3 tests, which is great. I did say we didn't need the soil test, but we do need the soil test. So sorry about that misspoken piece there. This is really important because there's a report that GoCrop generates that says this is your soil test schedule, which is important because in order to have a current nutrient management plan, you need to have a current soil test, which means a soil test within the last 3 years. All right, let's go check out our progress. Let's see, we've got a import that we've done here. Go to our fields, go to field 1, and our soil test has been entered here. If you have a situation, right, where like today, like I've got 20 fields, I can import all my soil tests, but I know I'm getting 3 soil tests later or 1 soil test back later, you can import just 1, but alternatively, you can add a soil test manually, which is very similar to adding other like analyses like your fertilizer, your manure separately. So I'm just gonna create a new field really quick to show you what that looks like. And I think one of the things I want to point out here is that if you have a soil test for 1 field, and historically you've managed it the same, so it makes sense to have 1 soil test for that. But this year, say, oh, I'm going to split it into 2 fields. You could use that same soil test for both your fields and going forward. And this is another way that you would enter that same soil test for a different field that has historically the same management practices, but is being managed differently this year. So to enter just 1 soil test, you press the little plus button in the field that you want to add your soil test to. And you fill in the information, right? Your date. And again, GoCrop is one of those finicky pieces, right? Where any date you put in, whether it's for record keeping or for manure applications or fertilizer or harvest, and same thing with soil tests, the sample date is in year, month, day. And so it's really handy to use the date picker to enter that information. And we're gonna scroll to 2021 in the fall. You don't need to fill in the lab information, but you can if you want, not required, but these pieces are required. So you would refer to your soil test for this information. And I think Heather will kind of go a little bit more into how to read and interpret a soil test during one of her lectures. I'm just going to throw some numbers in here. And then again, same thing, you'll have more information on your soil test, but GoCrop defaults to just the nutrients and the information it needs in order to calculate the nutrient balance and your recommendations. We'll save the soil test, and now that's entered in here. I think I have a few more minutes before 11, and so I'd like to take this time to show you how to enter manure analysis results, which is very similar to how you enter a soil test result. But to find that, you go into your farm tab, your nutrient sources, click manure, and then name it something that makes sense to you. So some folks have 1 pit, so they just say pit. Some folks have a few, so it might be pit 1 or stack 1, stack 2. You named your pit or your stack Fred, you can throw that in there too. Whatever makes sense to you is fine here. Again, this included sense is how GoCrop keeps track of information, so I at least put it back to 2019. And then for your manure source, you'd put if it's imported, yes or no. Typically it's not imported, but some folks do import other folks' manure. And if you do, you would need a current manure analysis. And again, for the purposes of regulations, that's every year there's manure needs to be tested, whether that's a pit or a stack. You choose your animal type here. the dominant. I know that like for animal type, for example, it's not uncommon to have dry and lactating cow manure into the same pit, but I would say whatever the dominant animal is that's going into that pit is there. Manure type, liquid, semi-solid, or solid, typically liquid. And this estimated annual total, I think this is a number that would be generated with tools that your land treatment planner has available. For some folks, I know that that tool can be really close to what's being generated, and for other folks, they're like, it's something's not adding up. And in those cases, if you have really great records showing how much manure is generated in a year, then that's a number that can be used in place of this. So I'm just gonna throw in some random number here. Occasionally, depending on someone's system, if they're importing, exporting manure, or we need to figure out, like they're in flux and we need to figure out how much manure we're saying was estimated that year, I'll put a note in this section in the new manure source. And this note that's put here doesn't come up anywhere else. It's just nice that to have some calculations here so that next time when you come in to update, if the estimated annual total is if you'll have that document of how you came up with that estimated annual total. I also sometimes put the same notes that I put here into the narrative as well. But you can work with your land treatment planner and your other technical assistance providers to figure out what makes sense for you here. All right, so after that, we've saved the manure source. And then we put in our manure test. And so similar like we just saw for the entering soil test results, we have to put our soil test date in. We'll have to be pretty recent. You put the lab in if you want, and then here's some standard information that is included on your manure test report. I think Heather again will kind of go into how to read and interpret your soil test report. So we're just going to put in some book value numbers. That you can find in your nutrient planning, not your nutrient planning book, but sorry, your nutrient recommendations field crops in Vermont. This is a handy reference in case you get your soil test report back and you're like, is this typical? I don't really know. There's this table that's typical values for, I don't know if you can see that well, for total nutrient content of dairy manure. So it's a nice little reference just to see how things are going. And I think the other one comment I'd really like to stress here is that on your manure test report, you'll have 3 categories for nitrogen. You'll have total, and then you'll have this inorganic form and this organic form. Just, don't add another row to account for the total, because then you'll be double counting your nitrogen every time you put an application of manure on. Just stick with the inorganic and the organic. Again, go crop default the nutrients that you need in order to calculate your nutrient balance. And yeah, you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat. So I'm going to see what's going on there. So Cindy asked if a farmer doesn't have a current but has an old soil test, can they add them for now? I think that might be a good question. Maybe Jeff, do you want to take that one on?
Me, Jeff? Really?
Sure, I'll take any Jeff. Jeffs have great answers.
There you go. No, I tend to put in fake numbers so I remember that they're fake numbers and then go back and put the real numbers in when I get them. Or you can use an old test, but you got to remember to go back and update it. That's all.
Cindy also says that a field has more than 20 acres, has 2 tests. How do you enter that? Typically, I average them. I don't know if somebody else has another answer how they approach that. So to clarify, I enter both the tests in separately, and then I enter a 3rd test in with the average, so that there's documentation of that.
On this soil test, you put your date in, so you would know that it was an old date.
Yeah, so I would put like, if you took the soil test like October 9th, I would put that date in for your soil tests. But then the average of them, I would put as like October 10th, because GoCrop's going to use whatever soil test is most recent.
No, I was backing up to the question before,
Oh, sorry.
whether to put, if you didn't have soil test, if you use an old one, if you put the old date in, you would know it's an old one because of the date.
Yes.
Right, that works, but I've run into trouble where I didn't have the year and the soil test was 3 years, 4 years, 5 years old, and then it won't accept that date. That's all.
Cindy also wrote in here that if you import or export, you need an import or export agreement to show that, especially to get your NMP approved. So if that's something that you'll have a handshake agreement with and you're getting your NMP done this year in our class, then in order to sign off on your nutrient management plan, we would need written documentation of that. And I think there might be an example of that in your binder.
Hey, Lindsay, that was my question. My question is, a farm produces some manure, all of it gets exported. If I put it in as a manure source and there's X amount of manure, there's no way to allocate that to get rid of it out of the program. How can you do that if that note never shows up?
So I was working with a producer this year and that was their situation. And so in that form that I showed, I put 0, but then in the farm narrative, that in the section that Heather went over last week, in the manure section, I wrote, according to the Vermont manure screening tool, we have our heifers generate X amount of tons, but it's exported every year. So that it's documented. Does that make sense?
Yeah, did you catch that, Peter?
I'll say it one more time. And probably not in quite the same words, but if you have a situation where you're exporting all the manure from a particular source, so if that's your pit or your stack, but all of that gets generated in 1 year gets exported in 1 year, when you're filling out that manure form, that nutrient source manure form, put a 0 there. But in that narrative, hold on, let me provide a visual on here. So in this section, when you're filling out your manure, you would put a 0 for estimated annual total. And then you could say in your notes, we generate, 100 tons of manure annually, but it is all exported. So, per stack, not imported, it's exported. So these guys, and it's solid. Save our manure source. And then, because, if someone's looking at this, they're like, well, why are they including a manure source with 0 generation? But they would know what's going on because if they go to your reporting tools, go to your narrative, floating blue bar to your plan details, and in your manure section, you'd say, according into the Vermont manure screening tool, our heifers generate 100 tons per year. All of the manure generated in 1 year is exported. And then you would have that signed export agreement with your nutrient management plan to verify that that is in fact what is occurring.
If you only exported part of it because you had excess manure, would you just put the part that you spread and then say that you exported the rest?
Absolutely, Cindy. Yes. And so, then this narrative would change a little bit. Our heifers generate 100 tons a year, and say 50 tons are exported. So we'll update the Vermont nutrient management plan. And then we'd go to our farm and our nutrient sources. We'd edit our heifer stack to say, all right, 50. We generate, and then leave that note here. We generate 100% annually, but. And so for some folks, like with the producer I just worked with this year, the amount that they export might vary from year to year. So I put, 2021, this is what happened. And then for 2022, change the amount that they were going to spread and left a note that said, but 75 tons is exported, and change this to 25. So these can be handy ways of keeping track of how things change and why they change in the event that an inspector is looking at your plan is like, what happened here? You have it written down somewhere in one place to help document that.
If you use land and only one track you rent a field from one farmer and he puts the manure on it, but you crop it and put the fertilizer or no fertilizer, you got to do an import for that.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think I'd like to defer to somebody with a little bit more experience that might be able to answer that.
Question again? Sorry.
If a farmer rents a track and the owner of that track puts manure on it, but the farmer who has it in his nutrient management plan crops it, does he import that manure the owner puts on it?
If he wants to count it, yeah. How else would you get the fertility value? There is another question about who's responsible for testing exported, imported manure. I'm not sure if there's like any real solid answer to that, except you need a test. So just get one. And whether you're taking it or, someone else is, you have to have one. If you're putting it on your fields, you have to have the analysis. Especially if you're importing manure onto your farm, there's going to be an expectation that there's an analysis. And in the short term, I think Lindsay already mentioned, you can use the book values, but you need to have an analysis for every single amendment you're putting on your fields. So if you're getting Giroux's poultry manure, you got to have an analysis for it. If you're putting on somebody's compost, it needs to have an analysis with it. If you're putting on your own compost, it needs to have an analysis. So, and any nutrient source that you are putting on those fields, you got to have an analysis. And as Lindsay mentioned, there are some book values. The liquid manure values are, I would say, pretty solid, but everything else is pretty variable.
Heather, please tell me that was an intentional pun.
It's funny. No. You already do jokes? So bummed I missed the jokes.
I've
been telling the zucchini joke has gone over well at my place, at my farm. Yeah, very funny. Okay.
All right, Heather, what type of sandals do frogs wear?
Oh, I don't know.
Open-toed sandals.
Funny. Okay, we better move on. It's got a lot to cover. It's not as good as zucchini. Zucchini. Anyway, thanks, Lindsay. I will say there's always a lot of, I don't know how many people are producing compost on their farm and spreading compost. If you are, you need to account for that as far as the volume that is used to make compost is really different than what's left after it's composted, right? So you build a compost pile, it's humongous, and 6 months later, it's half the size. So if your manure calculation that you've received is based on raw manure, and you're composting it, you need to account for that volume loss. And this came up in a plan I've just finally approved from last year. What the volume they were putting on the fields was a fraction really of what the original amount was. So again, hopefully you can address that in your breakout groups. And if you need any help, let me know. Manure volume calculations is not an exact science, and we're using best estimates, and the best number is your own, right? So if you're keeping really good track of what you're putting on the fields every year, you know what you're producing. And if you have those records and can match it up to the numbers that you're given, that's going to be the best way to know like how close our calculation is compared to the actual, quantity, volume of manure you're spreading. Anyway, all right. So Lindsay kept mentioning Heather's going to talk about the soil tests. So I guess I'm going to talk about the soil tests. I'm glad I planned to do that. Yes. Okay, so let me see. Let me get to the soil test. I think what would be helpful for folks too is to pull out a soil test while we go through this, make some notes. Okay. Couple pieces of information.
There's some
Everybody.
in your binders, an example.
that?
There's an example in
Example.
your, so you could put notes there if you didn't have one.
I'm holding up the booklet. Nutrient recommendations for Vermont field crops. We've got about 45 minutes to get through how to read a soil test, how to interpret it, and the phosphorus index today. So we can't cover nearly enough. And usually if we go into it too deep, people just start to, just not want to listen anymore. So this booklet right here, it's a really great booklet to read. It goes into depth about the soil testing that we use here in Vermont. And it goes into the interpretation of the soil test, the nutrients, etc. It's a really great document, something you can refer to. I actually would recommend that you read it. It's really, I think, would be helpful to you as a farmer to understand your soil test more beyond what we're going to be able to cover today. And it's in your binder, so it will be there. All right, so your soil test, we covered this last week. For a new plan, your soil test for each field cannot be older than 2 years, okay? I think most of you probably have current soil tests, meaning like within the last year, but the soil tests for the development of a new plan can't be more older than 2 years old. Once you have the plan in place, you need to be on a every 3-year testing schedule. So basically you need to have a new test every 3 years. Now, how you end up working that into your overall schedule is really up to you. You know, if you have 10 fields, sampling all 10 fields in a year is not a big deal. If you have 50 fields, sampling all 50 fields in that third year can be overwhelming. And I would really recommend that if you have a lot of fields, split it up. If you're rotating crops, and I would recommend, resampling those fields before you make a major change in your rotation, right? So if you're going from corn to alfalfa or alfalfa to corn, as an example, you definitely want to get a new soil test before you rotate into that next crop. And again, also, I would recommend always taking a new test if you're doing something drastic. So if you look at your soil test and you say, well, I got to put on a lot more fertilizer than I thought, and I'm going to get extreme here, and I'm going to the maximum. I'm going to try this out and see what kind of impact it has. Then you may want to, soil test the next year even. Okay. So you don't have to do it you have to do it every 3 years, but you can do it more frequently and, be making that decision based on what's happening on your farm, right? All right. So here's a soil test from Wilma Flintstone sent this in. That's my favorite. Love her. This soil test report comes out of UVM. Some of you may have Agri One or Dairy One soil test report. That might look a little different. The really critical piece, as I mentioned last week, is that the modified Morgan's extractant is used to analyze your soils. And again, if you go through UVM, University of Maine or Agri One lab in New York, they're on that, right? Obviously, our own state uses the right extractant. And the extractant really is for our soil types here in Vermont, okay? So if you're using a soil extractant from the Midwest, you're not getting the best information or, the relevant information we need here in Vermont. And I'll talk about that a little more. So the soil test, again, we already talked about how often, the labs, and timing, right? When's the best time to take a soil test? Well, frankly, I think the best time is when you have time to do it. So, ideally, I think fall tends to be the most popular time to take soil tests and also a good time to take soil tests. You're at the end of the season, the nutrient levels are drawn down really for the season. In the spring, we also tend to get sort of these flushes of nutrients that can come out of the soil from freeze-thaw cycles, as an example. So really the fall generally tends to be the best time. Sometimes you have more time in the fall, more flexibility to get out there and get the job done. But again, if you have time, just do it. Things to be cautious of are, if you are soil sampling in the middle of the season or something and you just spread a whole bunch of manure on a field, don't go stick your probe in a big fat cow patty, etc. Just recognize some of the limitations of doing it in season. If you just spread fertilizer and you go out and you stick the probe in the ground and you're getting granulars of fertilizer, it could screw up the test. So just recognize, some of those pieces if you're not doing it in the fall. Okay, so here's the soil test. You can see at the top, it should have your name, etc., when they got it and the county you live in. And then up here is the lab ID, and this field's called the corner piece. Now, whatever appears there under lab ID really should be, you should recognize that. It identifies the field, it may be, if you didn't take the test and maybe somebody from the conservation district or UVM went out and took the test for you, what appears here might be the FSA track and field number. And you may not recognize it. You may say, what field is that? Okay, so again, you may have to go back to your maps and match up or the information the LTP has given you, the land treatment planner, to match up that lab ID with your actual field name, what you call it. You need to have your name, okay, what you call that field on these tests. It's going to make it easier for you to, you know, connect the information back to the field. You also need to have the FSA track and field number listed on that soil test, because when an inspector comes out to inspect the farm, that's how they identify your fields, right? They're going to identify them by the track and field number. So we put the track and field number in Go Crop. I think Lindsay probably went over that today. And you also put your field name. But the track and field number is really what the state uses to identify those fields. So you need both on your soil test. So take the time over the next week to make sure that gets done. Okay, put the soil test in your binder in a way it makes sense to you. You know, like maybe put all the you know, corn fields together, or the fields that are in annual crops together versus those fields that maybe are pasture or hay. Organize them in a way that you can quickly get to the information that you're looking for. It does make a difference, you know, to have those organized. All right. Okay. So the next piece of the soil test, which is really great, everybody loves this little graphical representation of how this field's nutrient profile looks for phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. And the results show these categories: low, medium, optimum, high, or excessive. So just looking at this field, you know, I'm thinking, yeah, doesn't look too bad. You know, the phosphorus and the potassium anyway, these macronutrients, not great. They're not in the optimum range, but it's not low. Medium, that's okay. And higher excessive, especially for phosphorus and potassium, I'm not up there. So that's probably good, right? Okay, so what do those categories mean? And again, a lot of that is listed in this recommendation book, so you can go back and refer to this. So when we talk about low levels of nutrients in the soil, right, or optimum levels, this is really talking about like agronomics, okay? So on your own farm, if you have fields and you're flipping through those soil tests and you see there's fields that are low in a lot of things, you may think, well, at least I don't have a phosphorus issue. But the issue you do have is that your crops need nutrients to grow. And if it's low, then they're likely not getting what they need to maximize productivity, okay? And productivity can be measured in a lot of ways. I understand that. But when they're low, that likely means that yield and probably quality are really being impacted. And if you add that nutrient, okay, to the level on the soil test, so what's recommended, that's going to help you meet the need of the crop and also start to build up those levels, right? So low means that there is a very high probability of seeing a crop response if you add that nutrient, okay? Usually if you're in the low category, you need a lot of nutrients. You might be shocked by what the soil test is telling you, okay? If you have low phosphorus, low potassium, you could be looking at needing hundreds of pounds of that nutrient per acre to meet the need of the crop that you're growing, right? And I think I said this earlier, you don't want to be there, Okay, that means your crops are suffering, and likely if those crops are being fed to your cattle, which in a lot of cases, clearly they are, that means that the cows aren't getting as much nutrition out of them. And in a lot of cases, you may be having to buy feed, you know, because you're not getting enough production out of that. Okay, so if you're in the medium category, things are looking a bit better. And so what this means is that there's a moderate probability or medium chance of seeing a crop response if you add that nutrient. Okay, so the probability, or you know, the chance, the percentage of getting a crop response, okay, continues to go down as the level of nutrients in your soils continues to go up, right? That should make sense. So once you get into optimum, this is going to be the most desirable soil test range from both a crop perspective and really in a lot of ways an environmental perspective for your farm. Okay, so this means that there's a pretty low probability that if you add more of that nutrient, that you're going to get a crop response. So when you're in the optimum category, your goal is to maintain that level. And maintaining that level should be relatively easy once you're there. It doesn't take a lot, okay? So, you know, the recommendation may be something like, oh, you could use 20 pounds of phosphorus or 40 pounds of potassium. And what that's going to do is maintain those levels so they don't keep going down if you don't add anything, right? But we're talking about maybe limited nutrient availability on your farm. So maybe you don't have a lot of manure, or like super high fertilizer prices. You know, if a field's an optimum, you may want to think twice about if you're going to add any more, okay? Because the chance of the return isn't that great. So just adding it for the sake of adding it is likely going to be a losing proposition. Now, once you get into that high or excessive category, okay, it's higher than what you need to optimize the yield and the quality of that crop, okay? There's already enough in the soil, more than what your crop needs. So really, you shouldn't be adding any more, okay? Like, cut it off. Don't be going out, putting a bunch of manure on those fields if you don't have to, right? So if you're limited in the amount of manure that you have, don't put it medium levels. Okay, that tends to be easier said than done, but that's really the point of giving you these sort of rankings, right? So low means that if you add what is recommended on the test, the probability of seeing a response, okay, your return on your investment is going to be pretty good. But your return on your nutrient or fertilizer investment, once you get into that optimum and high range, is very low, if not even existent. Okay, so again, it'd be complete colossal waste of your money. So that's the point of getting a soil test. Like, where do you invest the nutrients that you have? Okay, and the nutrients that you may need to purchase, right? You don't want to be putting them on fields that have optimum ranges of nutrients. Okay, now with excessive and even high nutrient levels, especially for phosphorus, that we're very concerned about here in Vermont, and water quality issues, once you get really high soil tests or excessive soil test phosphorus levels, you know, the risk that that field poses to water quality goes up, right? Because there's just a lot of phosphorus in the soil. And the chances of that phosphorus potentially moving from that field, you know, into water, it just goes up because there's so much of it there, right? So again, the goal really is to keep those levels in the optimum range. And I would say sort of in the middle of the optimum range, right? Is really important. So that's what those low, medium, optimum, higher, excessive ratings mean, or rankings. So let's go down through the soil tests. Here we have soil pH, and I think most people are very familiar with the pH of the soil, as far as, you know, you want it to be somewhat neutral, right? Really, to maximize the agronomics or the productivity of the soil, unless you're growing blueberries or cranberries and a couple of other things, you really want the soil pH for all of our agronomic crops to be about 6.5, right? We actually want the soils to be slightly acidic, so less than 7. And depending on the crop, we may want that number a little closer to 7. So legumes, as an example, which are like essential, okay, to soil management productivity here in the Northeast. Legumes require pHs above 6 and definitely perform the best above 6.5. Okay, so if you're struggling, right, saying, oh, I cannot get any clover in my field, and you notice that your pH is below 6, or even, you know, around 6, 6.2, the legumes are probably suffering. You know, they need some lime, they need some calcium. Okay, all right, so let me see what my next slide is here. So let's dig into pH a little bit, not too much because we don't have a lot of time, but the pH of your soil in the availability of all the other nutrients, right? And so for micronutrients, folks know macro, micronutrients. So macronutrients, which are these listed here, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, macronutrients. It means that the crop, they're essential to the crop in large amounts, okay? Nutrients, iron, manganese, boron, copper, zinc, molybdenum, and there's some others, okay? Micronutrients mean they are essential to the crop, but in very small amounts, okay? Micro doesn't mean optional, doesn't mean not important. It means you don't need a lot, but you need them, all right? So when we're looking at pH, you can see that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, when the bar gets wider and fatter means there's more available, right? So when we're in this kind of 6 to 7 range, we see, you know, good availability of most of the macronutrients and, you know, decent availability of many of the micronutrients. Okay, so again, you know, as I said, staying at this, you know, around 6.5 it is a nice sweet spot, and you can kind of see why here, right? It lines up with all these nutrients. Now, what I want you to notice about some of them, like phosphorus, for example, if your pH starts to go down, the amount of phosphorus available goes down drastically, okay? So if you're on, if your soil test has a low pH and a low phosphorus level, if you lime and bring the pH up, the phosphorus level, available phosphorus level on your soil test will also increase, okay? Because phosphorus gets tightly bound by acids. So if you have an acidic soil, the things in the soil that make that soil acidic will bind to the phosphorus and make it unavailable to your crops. Okay, so it's impacting way more than you probably realize by not keeping that pH in that optimum range for the crop that you're growing. And just to keep it simple, that optimum range, you know, should be 6.5, 6.8. That's not much of a range, but just to cut to the chase here. Okay. So liming based on the pH is really important to, you know, nutrient availability. So just using phosphorus here as an example. I'll also say, you know, the pH highly impacts the microbial life in your soil. And the microbes themselves, many of those that are extremely beneficial to agriculture, like nitrogen fixing bacteria, okay, that we rely on, also perform best, you know, above 6.5. So just like do that. That's something that should be a top priority for you when you look at those soil tests. Easier said than done, I guess. Okay, so the pH here is pretty decent, right? 6.6. Okay, wait, did I miss a slide? Okay, we'll get to that. Let's go down the list here. You can see it says modified Morgan extractable nutrients. Again, this is that extractant I was talking about in parts per million, right? So it's not pounds per acre, pounds per ton, it's parts per million in the soil. So macronutrients, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are what are listed on a standard soil test. And you can see for some of those nutrients, we have these optimum ranges, and for some of them, we don't. Some of them, we just give an average, especially when we get into micronutrients, all right? And really the reason behind that is because we don't know the optimum range. It has not been studied. It hasn't been studied across a lot of crops. So we're giving you the average here. And I will talk a little bit about, you know, if and when you should really be concerned about some of the micronutrients. So on this particular soil test, the phosphorus level is 3.9. And it says here it's in the optimum range, okay? Or the optimum range for phosphorus, sorry, is 4 to 7 parts per million, okay? And we're at 3.9. So we're a little below the optimum. And if you look back up here on your little graph, you can see it's a little below optimum, but it's pretty good. You know, you could use some phosphorus, but not a whole lot. Potassium is 85 parts per million. It says here the optimum range is between 100 and 130. Again, look back up at your table here and you can see, okay, yeah, this makes sense. I'm in medium, I'm below optimum, a little more than I was for phosphorus, right? Calcium, we don't list an optimum range for that. And you can see in this particular soil, the calcium is really high. Some people get all worked up about this. Don't get worked up about it. You know, if you're in the Champlain Valley, you're going to have these ridiculously high levels of calcium. And if you're outside of the Champlain Valley, you may have relatively low levels. What we really want to be primarily looking at here is the pH and the base saturation and the cation exchange capacity, okay, to really kind of figure out if things are okay. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So magnesium, it says here the optimum range is 50 to 100. Ooh, this farm is at 110. Oh boy, people get worked up about this too. Don't get worked up about it. Where I want you to get worked up about it is if it's low, okay, or medium. If your soil test is calling for magnesium, get it on the ground. Don't ignore it. It's a critical nutrient. And magnesium deficiencies can wreak havoc in livestock operations, right? Magnesium deficiencies can lead to all kinds of metabolic issues. Same with too much potassium, especially on grazing operations, right? Have people ever heard of grass tetany? Okay, so make sure that you're adding that magnesium if it's being called for on your soil test. If you think the magnesium levels are way too high or excessive, again, the reason that might be is because of your parent material, right? What your soil was formed from has a big influence on some of those nutrients like calcium and magnesium, iron and aluminum. Okay, so you can't change, the genetic material of your soil, but you can understand what it's going to do to your crops and how you can manage it. In the case of magnesium, again, some places throughout the Champlain Valley can have really high magnesium levels. And it's not going to hurt your plants. It's when those levels are too low, or when your potassium and your calcium are either too high or too low, it can cause some issues too. Okay, I'll talk about that more. Sulfur's gained a lot of attention over the years. We hear a lot about us not having enough sulfur anymore. We used to get plenty of sulfur, during the acid rain days. Anybody remember acid rain? Remember writing your science report in high school or grade school on acid rain and killing the top of Mount Mansfield? Don't you wish that was our only issue these days, the old acid rain or depleted ozone layer? Anyway, but acid rain, we actually did a good job at reducing acid rain and sulfur emissions. So there is, this concern about, are we getting enough sulfur on our crops? I will say, I haven't really seen too many sulfur deficiencies. It can happen. It's most likely to happen on light textured soils that aren't getting any manure application. Okay, so it is something we can address if you feel like these levels are way below average. Let's talk about it. Think about some options there. All right, micronutrients are listed next. We have iron and manganese, boron, copper, zinc, sodium, and aluminum. All right, all important nutrients. Let's talk about iron, manganese, copper. Okay, we'll start with those three. We don't generally see too many issues with these three. Manganese, molybdenum, which isn't appearing on here. I have seen deficiencies in Vermont. I'm sure Jeff Carter has as well on certain crops, often on legume crops, soybeans is where I've seen it. Again, if you are on very light textured soils, and what I mean by that is sand, okay, very sandy soils with very low organic matter, and you haven't been adding any organic amendments. And when I say organic amendments, I mean manure, compost, okay, outside inputs that are going to bring in micronutrients, not commercial fertilizers, okay? But if they're light textured, no organic amendments, you definitely could have micronutrient deficiencies. Actually, chances are probably pretty good. All right. So you may want to consider adding a micronutrient pack, right, in your fertilizer. And again, these are things that are needed on really small amounts. We're talking a pound an acre. How do you put a pound per acre on the field? You go out and sprinkle a little fairy dust all over the place, right? No, it's hard. You got to blend it in with a carrier, something that's going to allow you to put that small amount of fertilizer on the fields, right? And so, as an example, maybe if you're a vegetable farm or an organic farm that isn't buying, granular fertilizers, but you need micronutrients, let's talk about some options, because there are options out there. Like wood ash, as an example, great source of micronutrients, right? Especially molybdenum, boron, okay, some of those. Now, boron in particular is a nutrient, boron and zinc. Boron in legume crops, okay, we know is commonly deficient in our soils in Vermont. We provide a blanket recommendation for boron on legume crops, 1 to 2 pounds per acre every year. Now, Again, if you're adding manure to those fields, you might be getting enough on the legume fields. But if these are 100% legume fields and you're not adding manure because of that, you know, you may certainly be low in boron. You should probably be adding some in if you're putting on other commercial fertilizers. Again, that's where this wood ash really works well on legumes because it has a lot of micronutrients, you know, plus calcium, lime, etc. Zinc. We also see zinc deficiencies in Vermont on corn, okay, on grass, not on legumes. So you're not going to put zinc on if you're growing alfalfa, but you may need to put zinc on if you're growing a crop like corn, for example. And we do provide recommendations on your soil test for that, okay? You don't need to just add it, right? Some people do, cost money. So again, make sure you need it instead of just going out and buying some of this stuff, especially with really high fertilizer prices. All right, let's talk about aluminum. Aluminum can be very high in Vermont soils. Okay, it can be so high that it limits crop productivity severely. Aluminum is an acid. Okay, so if you have high aluminum soils, it's likely that you may also have low pH, right? In this particular test, you can see the aluminum level is 27. That's low. This is probably in the Champlain Valley, right? And it makes sense because if aluminum is an acid and there's not much of it, okay, it likely means that there's more bases, right? Things that make the soil basic, like calcium. So if you're looking at your calcium level and it's really low, you may want to take a look at your aluminum level and see if it's really high, and then look at your pH and see what's happening there, right? So in this case, calcium levels high, magnesium levels high, these are bases. Potassium level, which is also a base, is decent, and the aluminum level is low. All of that points to a higher pH. Okay, so these things hopefully start to come together a little bit here for you now. All right, the aluminum level in this soil is low, so that also means it's probably not binding up much phosphorus. All right, and you know that's good for phosphorus availability. If you have a lot of phosphorus and you want more of it bound up, maybe you wish you had more aluminum. Now, for those of you have heard of like sealing, I don't know, a pond, and sometimes I don't know if they do this in lakes with alum. Has anybody heard of that? And so they do that to bind up phosphorus in some of these water bodies, right? To clean them up. And there has been some experiments, and Jeff Carter, I don't know if you did some of these experiments with aluminum, where people were considering, I don't know if they did it, adding aluminum to high phosphorus fields to bind it up, you know, to keep it from potentially moving into the water. All right, so aluminum can have some benefits, but you know, from a crop productivity standpoint, it's an acid and it can really harm production. So let me go down a little bit more and then we'll dig into that a little deeper.
Hey, Heather, there's a quick question in the chat, and that is, what does it mean if aluminum is double optimum?
Double optimum? Well, there is no optimum for aluminum. There's the average. So you can see here, it's got 1 star. 1 star gives you the average, 2 stars gives you the optimum range, right? So this star means that it's just the average. Now, if you look in your booklet, and you go to, let's see, page that's on. somewhere in here. Phosphorus, aluminum. You go to page 12. It gives you this, you know, reactive aluminum and the impact on phosphorus availability. That's one of the places where we use the aluminum level to make recommendations. And the other place that it gets used is for pH recommendations. And that's on page 4, okay? So the higher aluminum you have, the more lime it will take to raise the pH. And I'm gonna talk about that next. All right. Oh, wait, let me go back for a second here. Soil organic matter. So I'll address that in a second, I guess, that question. Soil organic matter, 3.3%. Now, what's good? People always ask that. What's good? Well, it depends, right? It depends on a little bit on your soil texture. And, you know, this particular soil, I think, should have a higher level, okay? The average organic matter levels in Vermont are quite high. You know, they're really around 4%, right? So for most soils that are not sand, you should really be striving for 4% organic matter in those soils, okay? And you know, on loamy soils and clay soils, I've seen soil organic matter levels on agricultural fields, you know, 8, 9, 10%, right? There is a level, of course, where you move from being a soil to just organic matter. And that's not always, you know, like a wetland I can think of, or a muck soil, right? They can be very productive, but they certainly have some challenges. Again, in most of our agricultural soils here in Vermont, you should be striving at least for 4%, but it is definitely possible to be much, much higher than that. And, you know, we'll talk about the benefits of organic matter. But on sandy soils, you know, it can be hard, especially on a vegetable farm, you know, as an example, where you may be using a lot of tillage. You may not be using perennial forage where you're not tilling and the soil sort of resting and building organic matter. It may be very difficult, especially on sandy soils, to raise those levels above 2%. Okay. So it's a lot more work to increase organic matter on those light textured soils because of the properties. And we'll talk about that, I think, next week or the week after. All right. Cation exchange capacity. 14.1 milli equivalents per 100 grams. What in the world does that mean? Effective CEC. Cation exchange capacity. So right here, we are usually striving to hit about 10 or 12. And again, if you have a sandy soil, this is going to be low. If you have a clay soil, this is going to be really high. Okay. And I'll describe why in a second. Below that is what we call the base saturation. This is the percentage of these cation exchange sites that have calcium on them, potassium or magnesium. So how many exchange sites have these positively charged bases? Remember I said bases, calcium, potassium, and magnesium. These are what make your soil basic, right? Less acidic. And you can go, what? Let me dig into this a little bit more. Your soil, if you have clay and organic matter, it has a negative charge, okay? Sand has no charge. Negative charges, right? We learned this in the 3rd grade, okay? Opposites attract, right? So the negative charge in your soil attracts positively charged nutrients and holds on to them. Okay. And when your soil holds on to these nutrients, those nutrients from potentially being lost, right, into the environment, holding on to them. And I guess it keeps them mostly from leaching out of the soil, if we can hold them on to the soil, right? So on a clay soil, you have more exchange sites. That's the cation exchange capacity, the ability for your soil to hold on to positively charged nutrients. So here's a soil with a CEC of 25, says more clay, more positions to hold cations. So many of these cations, right, are nutrients that your crops need, like potassium, calcium, magnesium. Oh, here's a key one, ammonium, right? So again, your soil is holding on to these. And those nutrients move off from those sites and into the soil solution, which is where your plant roots can grab nutrients, okay? Your plant roots do not suck nutrients off of those exchange sites. But when your plant roots pull nutrients out of the soil solution, which is basically the water in the soil with nutrients in it, okay? When your roots pull those nutrients up through the root, it creates a demand that causes the nutrients to move off from those exchange sites into the water, right? So nutrients will move off from the soil into the soil water and back onto the soil into the soil water, depending on how tightly they're bound to the soil. Now, the one nutrient that I'm missing here, critical one, is aluminum. Aluminum also has a positive charge. All right, so here's a soil particle as it looks under a microscope, just kidding. And here's the negative charge of this soil particle. And stuck to that negative charge are the positively charged nutrients, the cations, okay? So here's calcium, here's that aluminum, potassium, sodium, ammonium, oh, hydrogen, right? Everybody knows hydrogen makes things acidic. Magnesium, potassium, I think I already said that. And there's others too, but these are the predominant ones. All right, so base saturation. How many of these exchange sites have bases on them? Okay, that's the base saturation. And you can see, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9. 9 out of 15, right? So this soil is predominantly basic, and that shows up in the pH, okay? And on the soil test, it tells you which bases are present the most on those exchange sites, okay? Is it mostly calcium? Is it mostly magnesium or potassium? Which ones are driving the bases? All right, now in this case, there's some aluminum on this soil. It's not very acidic likely, but there's still some there. Now, if this particular soil particle was mostly covered with aluminum, there would be a lot less calcium, right? And a lot less potassium and other bases. And that means the soil would be more acidic, okay? Now, one thing I want you to notice is this 3+, 2+, 1+ on these positively charged nutrients. This is the valence. You know, in a lot of ways, it indicates kind of how strongly the nutrient is held. Aluminum is bound to the soil very tightly. It's really hard to get rid of, okay? Calcium is you know, pretty difficult to get rid of, and magnesium, but potassium moves very easily onto and off from the exchange sites of the soil. All right, so potassium is actually very susceptible to leaching because of that. It's bound weakly to the soil. Okay, and calcium is more tight, so isn't magnesium, and aluminum is kind of the max. So if you have a lot of aluminum on your soil and you want to get rid of it so that you can increase your pH, and phosphorus, like I mentioned, gets stuck here, and you want to liberate the phosphorus, what are you going to do? Okay, what you're going to do is add more bases, right? But because is so strong, you've got to add a lot of calcium to get rid of it. Okay, you have to overwhelm the system with calcium or magnesium. Usually people are using calcium, lime, calcitic lime, to get rid of the aluminum. So that's why if you have an acidic soil because of the aluminum level, you may need to add 4 tons, 6 tons, sometimes 8 tons of lime to increase the pH to an optimum level. If you have low pH because of hydrogen, you might only need to add a ton because it's easy to get rid of. All right. So again, adding calcium to the soil will displace the acids, and calcitic lime is the most common, but there's also magnesium products, especially if you need magnesium, and will increase the pH of the soil. Okay, so that's how we manage pH and why we want to manage it as well. So again, just to revisit this, cation exchange capacity, the soil's pretty high, probably means it's, you know, loamy soil with some clay in it. And most of on those exchange sites, right, most of it's calcium, actually the majority of it. The potassium here is low, you know, it's below 2%. We really would like to see this a bit higher, right? We really kind of want this in the 2 to 4% range. And it shows, right? It shows it's medium on your soil test. The magnesium level also says it's a little bit low on those exchange sites, but look, it's excessive. What? That doesn't make sense. And, you know, that's because the calcium level is more excessive, and calcium actually is stronger than the magnesium. So calcium is taking up a lot of those exchange sites, right? It's not causing a magnesium deficiency, but, you know, it is definitely the majority there. All right, so that is the gist of your soil test. Below that is the recommendations, okay? And these are really important. Though, are generated based on what you said you were going to grow in this field, right? So right here it says recommendations for oats, rye, wheat, triticale, millet. Now, if you look at this and you say, oh, wait, I'm not doing that. I'm growing tomatoes. Well, then this is the wrong recommendation. Don't use it. So recommendations are specific to crops and specific to what's in your soil. So you want to make sure that what you're growing is reflected on the soil test. Now, Go Crop will produce a recommendation for the crop that you say you're growing. Okay, so if you type in something different than what's on your soil test, it will pop up, you know, the hopefully correct recommendation for that crop. Not all recommendations are available, so you might have to, you know, put in your own, and we'll talk about that later in class. Right, so you can see here the target pH that we're shooting for these crops is 6.2. You're there, so you don't need any lime. It's telling you you need 60 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, and 60 pounds of potassium to achieve a yield goal of 60 bushels per acre. Well, where'd this yield goal come from? Well, that was put in to the soil test information sheet. Okay, so the recommendations are based off from what crop you're going to grow, what your projected yield is, right? Remember I said last week, you're going to have to be putting in what's your yield for that field. What are you expecting that field to yield? It's important information because it determines how much fertility you should be adding. Now, once in a while, for people to have a yield goal higher than what you're achieving. And that has to do with a lot of things. Like if you have a field that's only producing a ton of dry matter per acre, and you look at your soil test and you see it's low in every nutrient, that's probably why, right? It's producing a ton of dry matter per acre. But you want to get 3 tons. So we want to add the fertility for you to be able to achieve that yield goal. So in some cases, we want you to be striving for better, right? Or you may want to be striving for better, but we want to be realistic here, right? We know a cornfield's not going to produce 40 tons of corn silage per acre, usually, in most soils in Vermont. Okay, so a lot of this information, again, is being imported into GoCrop, right? Lindsay showed you how to do that. We're going to use this information along with, yields, soil type, and some risk assessments that we aren't going to have time to talk about today. We're going to have to push that till next week to develop a good recommendation for each field on your farm. So you can look at these for now, as you're kind of getting into NMP and see, get a gist of what the field is, requiring, but then we'll kind of dial that in as we get deeper into the class.